Delighted to welcome live into the studio with us today human rights and labour rights lawyer Dan Kovalik. Dan, thanks for taking the time for the chat to us today as well.
Thank you.
Great to have you on. On that, we'll get through some different points today, but just on that latter issue, why do you think it took so long for Western powers to allow Russia to access the site of the Nord Stream pipeline damage?
Well, I think there's two reasons. I think first, I don't think they wanted Russia to see any proof of who damaged the pipeline, because I think that would implicate the United States and the UK. But also, because they wanted it destroyed, they didn't want Russia to access it to be able to fix it. They want the Nord Stream 2 destroyed, and because they don't want countries like Germany to have the option of using it in the future.
We heard there numerous times through the weeks the Russian president alleging that the UK was involved in some capacity as well. Your thoughts on when you hear that? Of course, they're not directly involved in the conflict in Ukraine, but for all intents and purposes, it appears as if they've got a hand in things that are happening.
I think more than a hand. I think we know that U.S. and British intelligence are very much involved in helping the Ukraine military, certainly with targeting. We know the CIA, for example, has been in Ukraine even before the special operations, training various forces there to kill Russians. And by the way, that's in I was quoting people who were actually trained by the CIA. They were, that's what they were trained in. And as I understand the situation on the ground, essentially the Ukrainian military was more or less destroyed in the early weeks of the special operation. And, what Ukraine military is now fighting with is almost all from NATO. So this really is now a conflict between Russia and NATO, even though, obviously no one wants to say that explicitly, but I think that's what's happening.
Okay. Global food, the crisis, being able to solve that, very much top of the agenda for many countries. Russia has suspended its participation in the Black Sea grain export. What's your thoughts on that, first of all?
Well, obviously, I'm saddened by it. It's, people are going to be hurt by that. A lot of the world, particularly the Middle East and Africa, depend on grain from this region for their survival. At the same time, it does appear that there were attacks against the Russian fleet in the Black Sea by Ukrainian forces, and apparently the UK was somehow involved as well. And obviously, when that happens, it's no longer a humanitarian corridor, right? It's now a military corridor. So it's very regrettable, but I would say that it is understandable.
Russia points out that for many months since the initial UN brokered deal was done, a lot of the grain was going to Europe, or countries, in other words, that didn't necessarily really need it, at the expense of African, in particular, and Asian countries too. Russia says that it will give grain to Africa for free and then at market prices afterwards. So they're saying we want to look after the people most in need. But again, that message isn't getting through in the West.
No, look, the disinformation, the censorship around this conflict in Ukraine and around Russia in general, the disinformation and censorship in the West, and particularly in the U.S., which I can speak to because I am from the United States, is unprecedented. I have never seen this level of disinformation ever regarding any conflict. And that's saying a lot, because we've been lied to a lot about many things, about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, about the Gulf of Tonkin and Vietnam, et cetera, et cetera. But this is the worst I've ever seen it. They do not want to humanize Russia or even the Russian people. They want to dehumanize them to justify continuing to send billions and billions of dollars of armament to Ukraine.
Just one more question, Dan, on the grain exports. Should the UN condemn Ukraine for taking advantage of the corridor and explicitly say that this is affecting the world?
Absolutely. The UN should condemn that.
Will they?
I doubt it, because, again, the UN seems to be very much under the sway of Western and particularly United States government. So I doubt it. I mean, there may be some people in the UN, there may be certain bodies that condemn it, but I just think you're not going to hear much condemnation of it from the UN.
Okay. Just some other issues to touch upon while you're here, Dan. What do you think about Western claims about rising political unrest in China? It's been called a strategic distraction from the recent protests in the EU about food, about fuel insecurity. Would you agree with that? Is there more to it?
I mean, look, I think there's unrest throughout the world, including in the United States, and I don't think unrest in China is any worse. Yeah, so I guess I don't have much more to say.
Yeah, like we had headlines about during the Chinese Communist Party, the unveiling of the new leadership for the next 5 years, about the previous leader getting lifted and taken up. We don't know what happened to him, whether it was a head cold or was it something more extreme, but yet that didn't stop headlines from splurging as to what it could have been. Many column inches about something like that.
Yeah, well, and the fact that he was sitting next to Xi Jinping indicates that they were happy for him to be there. And there was, you know, what China claims, of course, is that the former president suffers from some form of dementia and, you know, needed to be escorted out for that reason. He was suffering medically somehow. But yeah, I mean, look, they're looking for anything they can to look for weaknesses in the Russian government, in the Chinese government, in the Iranian government. Again, because they don't want to look at their own weaknesses. They don't want to see their own economic problems, their own political problems. So they project all those problems on the rest of the world. I mean, that's what I see happening.
China has slammed reported US plans to permanently station nuclear-capable bombers in Australia. It's one of the stories we have on the rundown today. How would the expansion of the US military presence affect the balance of power in the Asia Pacific? How big a deal is this?
Oh, I think it's very, very dangerous. I mean, what you're seeing now, of course, we have to mention that now they're talking about putting nuclear missiles possibly in Finland, right? I mean, we are getting closer to a nuclear conflict. And by putting missiles closer to China, closer to Russia, is only making the world a more dangerous place. Again, we have to remember the Cuban Missile Crisis. The United States in 1962 wouldn't tolerate for 1 minute the idea of missiles being in Cuba, right? We almost went to nuclear war over it. That situation was resolved through negotiations very quickly, I think within 13 days or so. But we don't see or understand or empathize with the similar security concerns of Russia and China, the kind of reverse Cuban Missile Crisis situation.
But indeed, it's the rhetoric as well. You've got the US accusing Moscow of ramping up nuclear talk, rhetoric, and putting up fear. But yet, as you say in Finland, you've got the US proposing to put nuclear weapons on the very doorstep of Russia. Yeah,
well, again, it's projecting. It's projecting onto our enemies our own misdeeds. And on top of all that, the Biden administration apparently has now changed our nuclear protocol. I mean, apparently we're now open to a first strike against Russia, against China, for the first time in history has that protocol changed to that, from being purely defensive to a possible first strike. So again, I see the West, I see the U.S. in particular, as waving the nuclear saber much more than Russia is here.
Dan, I've been here a few years, and I've noticed in the speeches by the Russian leader he was quite respectful in the past, but now he's very direct with his words when it comes to Europe and the US. Just to give you an example, he recently said that Western hegemony is a dirty, bloody and dangerous game. What do you think he was focusing on there when he said things like that?
Well, I think he's referring to incidents since the collapse of the Soviet Union where you did have basically unchecked U.S. power. And what was it used for? To bomb Yugoslavia for 78 days, to invade Iraq twice, to invade Afghanistan and occupy it for 20 years, to support a terrible war in Yemen that has created the worst humanitarian crisis in the world, to destroy Libya. I mean, on and on. That is what U.S. hegemony has meant in the world. And I think why you see most of the world, meaning Latin America, Africa, most of Asia, supporting Russia right now is because they are tired of U.S. hegemony and they want that ended.
And again, that point doesn't really get risen, does it, in the West? When we talk about the world, it's seen from a very Western point of view. There's a big world out there with their own worries, their own problems, and their own relations and ties with Russia that's not being spoken about.
No, and again, very relevant. You just saw Lula da Silva elected in Brazil. Those types of leaders being elected throughout Latin America. I mean, you almost have a clean sweep. These are leaders that are also critical of U.S. intervention, of the Monroe Doctrine, of U.S. hegemony. That's happening for a reason. People are tired. They have seen the results of that. The result of U.S. hegemony has been war and destruction, and I think the world is fed up.
Are we living through the change in the global world order right now?
I think we are. I think, there's many birth pains to it, but yeah, we are seeing the birth of a multipolar world.
Interesting. Just one last note while we have you, Dan. The Israeli elections are happening right now, lots of machinations politically, but on the background to that, you've got Palestinians in contested occupied territories, not allowed to stand, not allowed even to vote. They've got no say in those elections. I put it to you, why is that not? I know we've spoken about it, but why is that not touched upon in the West? Whereas many, many headlines about what happened in Iran, the tragic death of a woman in Iranian custody happened. But there's such a disparity in the column inches given to both things.
Yeah, well, Noam Chomsky used to talk about the worthy and unworthy victims. The worthy victims, meaning those who deserve inches of news coverage, are people in countries that the U.S. doesn't like, right? Adversary, enemy countries. We focus on those victims. We don't focus on the victims of the U.S. and its allies like Israel. We downplay those victims. In the U.S., for example, there's 40 to 50 women killed a year by police, right? That's not discussed in light of what happened in Iran. And again, when you look at what's happening, particularly in Gaza, you have one of, again, the worst humanitarian crises on earth being created by Israel, by its blockade of Gaza, by its war crimes in Gaza. And again, that is off limits to discuss because Israel is such a close ally of the United States.
Well, Dan, you're not off limits to this program. It's such a pleasure to have you here and discussing all those topics with us. Dan Kovalik, human and labour rights lawyer, live and direct. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you, Neil.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.